really nice that he's talking on randomized control trials and its appraisal for especially for the Northeastern group, although there are other participants also who joined today. Professor Sameer Malhotra is Chief of Clinical Pharmacology Department in PGI, and he's been very actively associated with us with the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine at PGIMER. He's also a very active member of our Cochrane group, for which we have become an affiliate. And I would now request Dr. Malhotra to start his talk. I'll read Dr. Vivek or Dr. Kusum to formally introduce him.
Hello, good afternoon. Myself, Dr. Kusum Singhal. I am working as a scientist C, the project Northeast Capacity, and we are conducting this chain of capacity building in Northeast region, and in this series of sessions today our session is based on randomized control trial, its conduct and Dr. Sameer Malhotra will deliver a lecture on this. Start.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Dr. Meenu, for this. Today, I don't know, actually, I had slightly modified my, way of presentation today. I'm sure the participants will have some basic understanding of clinical trials. Don't have, then I'll go a little slower. Otherwise, I'll move a little faster. So what I would request the participants is that they should not hesitate to ask to interrupt in between, because otherwise you will not be able to make out what I am trying to present. And what I am going to do is I am going to today tell you a story which is very typical of the field of clinical trials and clinical research. With the help of this example, which I asked the group to share with the participants, I hope the participants were able to get it, and at least they could look at the abstract, if not the whole paper. Is it correct? Okay, in any case, let us move ahead. So this paper is in New England Journal of Medicine. It is eluting stents or bypass surgery for left main coronary artery disease. It was published in December 2016. Now, as you know, even if you don't need to be a cardiologist to understand this paper, you don't need to have any extra knowledge about the disease or the pathophysiology or anything of this sort, because we are going to take up the highly critical, the clinical trial part only. This study addresses a very important question. As you know, many of you would know, if there is this coronary artery of which the main branch is the left main coronary artery. Now, if there is a stenosis in that coronary artery, left main, the standard of care is coronary artery bypass grafting, or CABG. Okay. For the past few years, or let's say decades, couple of decades, what this CABG is the domain of the cardiothoracic surgeons, whereas the cardiologists have been trying to enter this field through what they call interventional cardiology, meaning whereby that they put a stent into the coronary artery and sort of remove the stenosis. So, as I said, although CABG is considered to be the standard of care for left main coronary, there have been a few studies in which this it is called PCI, that is percutaneous coronary intervention, PCI, I mean, the process of putting the stent, which has been shown to be as good as the uh, bypass. So I'll start with the with the study, and as the topic, the title of the topic also mentions consort. So consort is a standard for reporting of clinical trials. So I'll start sort of backwards from reporting, and from where we'll discuss the design issues and statistical issues and all other things. So this means what we are today going to look at is how a trial should be reported and how this trial has been reported. And then you will understand what I am trying to explain. So the first part of the trial is the abstract of any paper is abstract, but we are going to skip that for a moment. Maybe we will return to it later if you have any questions. So the first part is the background or the introduction section. So in that introduction section, you have to tell why you want to do the study and what is already known on this topic. So here they have a very short introduction section, just half a column of the article, and there they tell about the very basic thing that as I said, that CABG is the treatment, standard treatment as per guidelines, but there has been a trial in which it was shown that PCI or stenting is as good as CABG. But here is something very interesting that they tell, and I'll read what their words, exact words. They say that the results of the trial represented a subgroup of a subgroup. That's extremely interesting. So but I am sure you have heard of subgroup analysis in trials. Subgroup analysis is when you have a whole population of the trial, and you divide those participants into different categories based on, say, age group or some other risk factor like diabetic, hypertensive, and so on. And then you do analysis of your trial based on those subgroups. But here they say that there has been a subgroup of a subgroup analysis, which is very interesting. But then they say that any subgroup analysis should only be considered as what is called a hypothesis generating type of issue, not sort of anything that confirms the that information or that data. So they say this subgroup analysis, from that subgroup analysis, they got the idea that we should conduct. Second reason they give why they want to give this study is that the stents that were used at that time when this study was done, say 5-10 years ago, the stents have improved, which is expected. All drugs and devices get improved with time. And the third reason they give is that even the technique of surgery has improved. So this is their brief background, very nicely written, no excess, words, nothing to, occupy a lot of space. After all, this is NEJM, their space is, a premium. So just one paragraph, and that is their background, very well written. So this is how I recommend that you should be writing your background in the introduction, the introduction section. Now they come to the methods. The first subheading in the methods is trial design. This trial is given an acronym of Excel trial, EXCL. I'm not going to tell you the full form, it doesn't matter. So we'll just remember the name is Excel trial. So in the design part, they write that it is an open label, multi-centric, randomized trial. Okay. So open label, that means the physicians and the participants, they know what subject is going to get what. Of course, it will be extremely difficult to do a blinding in this type of a study where one group is, undertaking surgery, other group is some intervention through the femoral or the radial artery. So it's virtually impossible to do a blinding in this type of a study. So there is open label, multi-center, because they plan to do a large study across many centers in many countries, and it's a randomized trial. Randomization, as you all know, means the way subjects will be allocated to surgery or stent will be decided by chance. Okay, so this is the way they report it. But they also write that the protocol of this trial is available elsewhere. So if you want to look at the detailed protocol, you can go there. And then they write that the protocol was prepared. Here you have two, different category of physicians involved. One is the cardiologist, one is the surgeon. Now both have to agree to come to a conclusion regarding the protocol. So they say that surgeons and cardiologists were equally represented in this protocol making, and all of them approved the study protocol. And this study was, it's an important point to keep in mind because it becomes relevant later, was funded by a company which makes a lot of these stents and devices, which is Abbott. It's a very famous company, large company, multi-billion-dollar company, Abbott. Okay. And then they say that this company was not involved in the writing of this manuscript. Okay. Or in the data analysis. Okay. So this part they clarify that although this study is funded by the sponsor, this was not, they did not have any role in this, but they they were given this manuscript for review, although they did not have any say in that. And then they write a very interesting thing, which I'm sure you will find, of some interest. They say the principal investigator, and which means the first three authors and the last author, that is four authors. PI was the last author. They had unrestricted access to the data and were involved in the analysis of data, wrote the manuscript. So, we typically assume that if I am the co-investigator in a study, I will look at all the data before my name is included in that paper. But here it wasn't the case. Only four investigators had access to full data. So the others did not have any access to the full data. So this is the another point which you keep in mind. Then they talk about the inclusion criteria. Now, inclusion criteria in a clinical trial basically mean that what are the type of patients that you will want to include in your trial and which you want to exclude. Now, typically, these inclusion exclusion criteria tell us about the future generalizability of the study. If these inclusion exclusion criteria are very narrow, that would mean that a lot of patients who come to your OPD with a particular illness will have to be excluded. And when you conduct the trial, the results of that trial will not be necessarily applicable to those people that have been excluded. So, especially in a trial in which you expect to enroll a lot of patients, which you really want to answer a scientific question with respect to an important aspect that has still not been answered, it is better to have rather loose inclusion exclusion criteria, keeping only the very essential ones and not restrict yourself too much. Restriction is important if you are doing a very early phase of a trial, like sometimes we do clinical trials which are phase 1 trials in healthy volunteers or a very brief small subset of patients. There we keep the inclusion exclusion criteria very stringent. In this type of a trial, it's better to have extensive, I mean, inclusion exclusion criteria that are more inclusive rather than exclusive. So their main inclusion criteria was the stenosis of the coronary artery of 70% or more as estimated visually, or stenosis of 52. In any case, this is not important. So they have a method that okay, this much stenosis in the coronary artery that will include. Any age, any gender, they will include. Okay. Then they have this scoring of coronary artery anatomy. So this is another thing that they have used, that they want to have a coronary anatomy which is low to intermediate. Again, we are not going to go into the details of that, But any disease you want to tackle in your clinical trial, please make sure that the definition of your disease, the patients you are going to include, it has to be quite specific. There should be no ambiguity, and people who want to include should be very clear. Okay, so based on this, they now know that okay, these are the patients we will include. Then they are going to randomize. Here, randomization is interesting. Again, there are a couple of points that we need to that are of importance for our purpose. So first of all, nowadays, most of the times when we conduct clinical trials which are funded by pharmaceutical companies, there the randomization is web-based. It's called interactive web-based randomization. Uh, in our smaller studies or trials that we do, as part of thesis work or smaller studies not funded by pharma but by some agencies like the ICMR. There we do computer randomization. Both are equally good. Web-based randomization is necessary when you have a lot of centers, say 200, 300 centers for the trial, and the centers are geographically spread. So you need to have a central place from where this randomization will be generated. This simply means that when you have a patient, if you are the PI, you have a patient which can now be included in the trial. It has satisfied your inclusion exclusion criteria. You enter your patient some that web based. Sometimes it's a telephonic interactive system. So you give them a call, and they will tell you that okay, because this is an open label study, they will say okay, this patient will need to go to surgery or stent. So this is what they are going to tell you. The second point in randomization that they are doing here is what is called stratified randomization. Okay. Now stratification means that they are going to divide their whole number of patients into subgroups, and the subgroups in this case, one subgroup in this case I will tell you is diabetics. Okay. So this means stratified randomization means that, for example, a patient who is in the surgery group, that surgery group will be divided into diabetic versus non-diabetic, and randomization will be separate for these two. Similarly, in the stent group. Now, this is done to ensure that number of diabetics in both the arms, surgery versus stent arm, remain more or less the same, and not, there isn't a big difference in the numbers, because if there is a large difference in these strata, then there becomes, statistical significance becomes an issue. And in any case, so this is what is called a stratified randomization. The next thing was, what they did was, in terms of randomization, it's a block randomization. Now, block randomization means it's different from stratified randomization. Block means they made block sizes of 16, 24, and 32. This means that if you have a block size of 16, in that 16, 8 patients will go to surgery, 8 will go to stent. If it is 24, 12, 12. So this is the way to ensure that the sample size in both the groups, both the arms are equal. So in randomization, there are 3 points that in this trial are worth noting: web-based interactive, stratified randomization, and block randomization. Okay. Okay. So now then they describe the procedures, what was done, how stenting was to be done, how surgery was to be done, what investigations were to be done, like cardiac enzymes, ECG, and so on, which you will need to write for your own studies whenever you write, and the follow-up. How much was the follow-up? At what time points was the follow-up? 1 month, 1 year, 6 months, so on. This study intended total follow-up was 5 years, with one in between what is called interim analysis, at least one at a follow-up of 3 years. So this paper that I am showing to you is analysis of that 3 years of data. Okay. Now come to the next important component of a clinical trial, that is the endpoint. What should be your endpoint in a clinical trial? Now, endpoint is something that you are going to measure, that is going to decide the answer to your research question. Okay. Now, in this trial, the endpoint was what is called a composite endpoint. Now, a let's take an endpoint of death. Okay, it's a very good endpoint in the sense that it is objective. It is, there is no ambiguity about it. There is no problem with the definition of death. You will see how this is important. And but the problem is death in many cases will not be a very common occurrence. Okay, like in this type of a trial, you see maybe a death rate of percent per year. So the number of events based on which you want to make the comparison between the two arms will be very small. So what they do is they do use what is called a composite endpoint, which means endpoint consisting of several other elements. So in this particular trial, they had a composite of death, stroke, or myocardial infarction at 3 years. Okay, so this is the primary endpoint. So the primary endpoint of your trial should be that which is the most important endpoint for your study, and which takes into account also the feasibility part of the study, because sometimes an endpoint may be extremely good, but it simply is not feasible to use that endpoint in a trial that you are managing. For in that case, you need to resort to what are called surrogate endpoints, or endpoints that measure something which is not the exact hard outcome that you wanted to measure, but a surrogate of that endpoint. For example, LDL cholesterol is a surrogate endpoint for ischemic heart disease, or cardiovascular death related to coronary artery disease, and so on. So surrogate endpoint should be validated to represent your main endpoint. Okay. In this trial, they haven't used any surrogates. They have used the primary endpoint, as I said, death, stroke, and MI. Combine a combination of all three. Once you have a primary endpoint defined, and in this case also they have secondary endpoints. Now, individually each of these components of death, stroke, and so on, and then there are some complications and so on. So all these you need to define. Okay. Now the next point that you have to very carefully write is statistical analysis section. Okay. Because most of the time that our studies get rejected, they are not because we poorly designed them, they are because we did not plan them in terms of statistics. And this is a problem, we commonly come across many of our colleagues who will come to us to sort of plan their study to make a design in such a way that the statistics part is taken care of. And it's important that you do this statistical part before you start your study, when you are writing your protocol. Sometimes our colleagues do come to us after they have conducted the studies, and it becomes a little difficult to manage. So in terms of statistics, the first thing that is you will need to know is that this study was planned as a non-inferiority trial. Okay. So non-inferiority means they wanted to show that putting a stent in the patient is not inferior to the surgery. Okay. So what other types of trials are there in this aspect? One is called what is a superiority trial. Now, superiority trials are typically those in which a drug or active intervention, active something, is compared with no drug or placebo. Okay, the typical placebo-controlled trials where we say that okay, the drug was superior to placebo. Okay, here the it is a non-inferiority trial. Another type of trial is what is called an equivalence trial. Equivalence trial is that in which you show that your new drug or new intervention is equivalent to the existing or standard of care and so on. Okay, so this in this aspect, this is a non-inferiority trial. When you have a non-inferiority trial, there is what is called a non-inferiority margin. Okay, that you have to define. Like for example, I'm not now taking this example. Any study you take, let's say death is the endpoint, and in the conventional control arm, the death rate is expected to be say 10%. Okay, now for if you want to show that your trial, your new drug is not inferior to the existing standard of care, so you will see you need to define the margin within which the result should lie, the confidence interval of the result should lie. For example, in this case, it is 4.2%. Okay, this is again a very you know strategic decision that has to be taken. It's a tricky decision because if what happens is like for example in one trial you are getting your result 10% in the standard arm and 8% in the new drug arm. So the difference between the two is 2%. But when you can calculate the 95% confidence interval, it is say 6% to 1%, 1% to 6%. Now, if your margin was 4%, like in this case, the margin 6% is the confidence interval, that confidence interval has been crossed, and that means your new drug is inferior, not, you cannot claim non-inferiority, which was your idea or hypothesis. Okay. So here they say that the primary endpoint, the margin is 4.2%. Okay, for the upper confidence interval. This is a classical example of a non-inferiority trial. So they say that there will be, they assume that the incidence of combined MI, death, and stroke will be 11%. But if there is a difference between the two arms, and if you take a 95% confidence interval of that, it should not cross 4.2%. That's the main idea. Okay. And then you include some loss to follow-up cases and so on. So here they had 8%. And then you do your sample size calculation based on this. So they say 80% power, non-inferiority margin of 4.2%, and one-sided alpha of p-value that is 0.0025, that is half of 0.05. Okay. The other thing that sometimes original sample size calculation said 1,600 subjects to achieve 90% power. 90, in such large trials, usually you keep the power at 90%. But somehow their recruitment was very slow, and in between they changed the power from 90% to 80%, and the number of patients got reduced to 1,900 from 2,600. So by reducing their power by 10%, the number of patients reduced by 700, which is a very large number. Now, is this kind of a thing justified in between a trial? You have already started the trial. Now, there can be a lot of debate around this issue. If it is, sort of everything is transparent and everyone knows what's okay, but again, it's not a simple issue to be, decided so quickly. In any case, they reduced the sample size from 2,600 to 1,900. Okay, moving on. Then they talk about the statistical analysis. So what they are saying is they use Kaplan-Meier estimates. Now Kaplan-Meier statistical test is a test of which is called a survival analysis, in which this type of data is going to come, and survival analysis and the hazard ratio, corresponding hazard ratio. Now, I'm sure you have heard of odds ratio, relative risk, and so on. Now, hazard ratio is similar to those, except that in this case, the data is for as for a survival analysis. Again, I'm not going to go into details of this, but so this is their estimate that they want to make hazard ratio with 95% confidence interval. And then they write what we also typically write in our, clinical trial protocols, compared with chi-square or Fisher's exact test. Continuous variables were compared with t-test or Wilcoxon test and so on. P-value 0.005. So pretty much standard stuff. Let's move on to the results section. So here they write in the results section, they write that they are using the consort method, consort statement to present their results. Consort, as I said, consolidated standards for reporting of trials. Now, if you have not seen this, I recommend you go to this website called consort-statement.org, where they write it's a 25 item checklist. If you write your trial according to this checklist, the probability of getting published improves by a lot. They also give what is called a standard, chart, how you should make, what is called the flow chart of your trial, like how many patients you screened, how many you excluded, the reasons for exclusion of those patients, how many you finally randomized, and how many you analyzed, how many got lost to follow, and the reasons for the loss to follow. This type of a flow chart is absolutely a must in clinical trial publication. In this paper, they don't present that this flow chart, but they say that it's given as a supplementary as an appendix, which is there on the website of NEJM. Okay. One thing they don't mention is that the trial was registered at some site, which in our case it is extremely important. All trials that we conduct have to be registered at CTRI, Clinical Trial Registry of India, and you cannot, in today's scenario, you cannot start to recruit your trial a patient unless your trial is registered at CTRI. It's as per law, you are violating the law. They don't mention this part, but it's okay. But I know that the trial was registered because I checked on the US clinical trial registry site. Okay. So coming to the next part of the result section, that is baseline characteristics. Now, whenever you are reporting your clinical trial, you must have a table of baseline characteristics where you compare the baseline, where you tell how many patients of which age group, which other condition like diabetic, males versus females. In this case, they also talk about race, white race, and others. Then diabetic, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, smoker, prior history of MI, prior history of surgery, heart failure, prior stroke, and they tell how many percentage of patients were there in each group, stent versus the surgery group. Now, this is, because the patients have been divided by random, it's not important to do a statistical analysis of this section because we know that they have been decided by chance. But when you look at this data, that's why I told you may do it later when, once you, after the session. When you look at this baseline characteristics table, you will see that, all of us know that for coronary artery disease, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, smoking, heart failure, past history, body weight, they are all risk factors, renal disease. Now, interestingly, most of these risk factors are slightly higher in the stent group as compared to the uh, surgery group. Now, they haven't discussed this part in this. Probably they think it's not important, But I think it is a little interesting that more risk factors are there in the baseline characteristics in the stent arm. Okay, but in any case, they talk about how many stents were on an average put, how many grafts were put. That's important for them. So, but we won't go into those details. And they finally come to the result, the primary endpoint. Okay, so they say that the primary endpoint was seen in 15.4% versus 14.7%. Okay, so that means slightly lower in the surgery group, just 0.7%, very small difference. But this difference is not important per se. It is the confidence interval of this difference that's important. Especially the upper limit of this confidence interval, which they say was 4%. Okay. Now, if you remember, I told that the non-inferiority margin was 4.2%. So here they got is 4%. So they just missed by 0.2%. If they had got a upper limit of confidence interval at 4.3%, they would not be able to claim non-inferiority. So they just got lucky in that sense. So and then they report the p-value for non-inferiority is p is equal to 0.02. Now you may not have understood this concept of non-inferiority in terms of hypothesis testing as they do in statistics typically. The null hypothesis for a non-inferiority trial is opposite to that of the typical trial that we do, that there is no difference in the two arms. Here we say null hypothesis is that the new treatment is inferior to standard of care. Okay. So when the result gets significant, we reject this null hypothesis and we say it is not inferior. Okay. So it's a slightly different kind of uh, interpretation of p-values and the null hypothesis. Okay. So this is then the report for their secondary endpoints and so on. This is not, I'm not going to go into the details of that, but they say that the arrhythmias and other complications were higher in one group versus other and so on. So they discuss this. And finally, they write about the discussion. They say that the drug-eluting stent was non-inferior to CABG in the discussion. And then there is a very interesting statement that they make, which says that the result of this trial suggests that stenting with everolimus, which is the drug-eluting stent, is an acceptable or perhaps preferred alternative to surgery. Okay. Now, I find this statement to be totally not corresponding to the data that they have given in the result section. Okay, you should your primary endpoint you just missed being being inferior, and then you say perhaps preferred alternative. Okay, then they talk about some real studies which have been done like we do. What were their results? And that's how they reported. And then they talk about the limitations of the study, that it was open label study and some other things. So this is how they report. But as I said, it's the story. So the story actually starts after this trial was published. Okay. So as I said, this is a very important study in that surgery is being compared with non-surgical intervention. And what happened was, when we say endpoints, the main lesson from this study is this, which I'm going to tell you, that when you keep your endpoints, these endpoints have to be defined very clearly in your protocol. Now, in this case, if you look at the primary endpoint, death, there is no problem with the definition. Stroke, there is also no problem with the definition because you have weakness with CT scan or some of those. But definition of MI, you will say there is no problem, but there it became a problem. Okay. Now in their original protocol, they had written that there will be two definitions of MI that will be used. Okay. One definition is what is being used by the interventional cardiologist. Okay, according to that definition, there should be elevation of cardiac enzymes by 10 times. Okay, but this is not what is called a universal definition of MI, UDMI. According to the definition, it is the change in enzymes that is important, and along with that, there has to be some other change like ECG or symptoms of ischemia or angiographically seen thrombus. Okay, or on some scanning there is myocardium that's not viable. So this universal definition of MI, now this study became one of the biggest scandals in the history of medicine, and that was the reason I chose this study for discussing with you this topic. Why this became a big issue was that the definition, the universe in the protocol they wrote that we will use both the definitions of MI, the and the universal definition. But in the paper that they presented in NEJM, this is a 3-year presentation, 3-year follow-up data, and they last year they published 5-year data also. They did not present the universal definition of MI. Now, what is the issue here? The issue is that whenever you talk about MI with respect to these procedures that the patients underwent, intervention versus surgery, if you only look at enzyme increase, that increase is much higher in the surgery group because there is more manipulation of the cardiac muscle. It is much less in the stent arm. Okay. If you use the universal definition, which includes other features also, then this picture changes. Became very angry with the way the results were presented. The surgeon said that you are deliberately trying to, improve your stent data by not giving this information, and the results they got were extremely, striking in the sense that when you look at only the, their definition, narrow definition of enzymes, the MIs were much higher in the surgery group. So overall, the primary composite endpoint became towards non-inferior. But if you use universal definition of MI, which is enzyme plus one other element, then the number of MIs strikingly changed more towards stent. And if you look at that way, the primary endpoint would have shown that the stenting is inferior to surgery. Okay. Now this data, how this data became known is also interesting. Someone leaked this data of universal definition of as data as per universal definition to BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. Now the BBC, someone sent an Excel file of the data. Now the BBC hired a statistician to do the analysis, and they found that the risk of MI was in fact greater with stent arm with a hazard ratio of 1.79 with confidence interval of 1.25 to 2.57. The rate of MI was almost double in the stent arm as compared to surgery arm. So this led to a huge scandal. Some of the surgeons withdrew their name from the publication. A lot of scientific societies and scientists wrote to the NEJM to change their publications and make the necessary alterations. The NEJM refused to make any changes, but they published a series of letters in the in NEJM, which discussed all these issues. Now, although the surgeons were very angry with this, that the definition of MI has not been done properly, the cardiologists, the non-surgeons, they say that all of this was pre-decided and surgeons were already, part of the protocol writing, and at each step they were informed of what's going on. So this became, a huge scandal, and it's still not resolved, but more people are nowadays inclined towards, more towards surgeons, in the sense that they think that there has been something that's improperly done by the cardiologist. The main reason being, now come to the final point, that the study was funded by the stent maker Abbott, and one of the authors was a employee of the company. Most of the cardiologists had taken financial grants, or their universities had taken grants from these stent making companies. And that is why, this whole issue is considered to be a historical issue in the world of clinical trials. And I do wish you people will read more about it, find some more interesting data about this. For example, and this is the last point, the rate of death. Now, the data presented at 3 years showed the death rate to be slightly higher in the stent arm as compared to surgery arm. But at 5 years, the data starts to get, the curve, Kaplan-Meier curve starts to diverge and towards more harm, more death in the stent arm. But the surgeons allege that the Data and Safety Monitoring Committee, I'm sure you have heard of DSMC or DSMB, Data and Safety Monitoring Board, that when the Data and Safety Monitoring Board asked for the data about death, the principal investigators did not share that data with the DSMB, which makes the case for surgeons, at least I tend to now favor more towards surgeons, although to be fair, surgeons also had a conflict of interest in this, that, it is, if a patient undergoes stenting, the surgeon does not earn money out of that. So both of them had conflicts, but the available evidence suggests that it was more of, the cardiologist conflict of interest that is more important in this, due to the involvement of the stent making company. Now, I think I'll stop here, and I'll really wish people to ask any clarifications, give some comments, ask questions. We still have around 15 minutes to go. If anything was not clear, anything you want more clarification on, or some unrelated questions, you are all welcome.
Thank you so much, sir, for such a informative lecture. Now participants are requested to kindly unmute yourself and they may ask questions.
You can maybe check the chat if there are any questions in the chat.
We have a couple of questions in chat box also. The first question is asked by Dr. Mithun. He asked for, can you please explain the surrogate endpoints once more, sir?
Okay. So surrogate, the meaning of the word surrogate is that it stands for something else. So some of the endpoints that are really, important endpoints with respect to patients, like I said, stroke. Stroke occurs, there is serious, problem with the patient, or ultimate is death, right? Or heart failure, congestive heart failure. But the problem with these endpoints is that these sometimes take years to develop. And, for example, let's take the example of sepsis. If we take sepsis is a serious condition and death rate can be high, maybe 40%. And if you have a trial in sepsis, some new antimicrobial versus old antimicrobial, you can compare mortality in the two arms with 40%, death rate. And with a very few subjects, you will be able to get decent numbers of, people who get some event, and you can measure that event. But in trials in which the death is very low, say it is occurring at the rate of 1% per year, or Development of heart failure is occurring at 2% per year. Stroke occurs at maybe 1% over 2 years. Now you will need extremely long follow-ups, very large sample sizes to get at those endpoints. So what people have devised is that to this surrogate endpoint, which is exactly sort of representative of the your hard, I call them hard endpoints like death or stroke or MI or heart failure. So for example, even blood pressure itself, if you talk about hypertension, blood pressure is a surrogate endpoint because per se blood pressure has no meaning. A patient may have high blood pressure by our definition, but if it does not lead to heart failure or death or renal disease, it has no meaning. But it has been seen that even 1 millimeter increase of blood pressure can lead to this much percent increase in heart failure rate or stroke rate over a period of 5 to 10 years. So this blood pressure becomes a surrogate endpoint. So what is its advantage? It's very easy to measure. It will be changing very quickly with response to therapy, and it will be, it will be measured in all the patients. Death will not occur in all the patients. So you can get to your result more quickly and with easier, lesser number of patients. But here is a caution: even such an established surrogate marker like blood pressure may not represent the exact hard endpoints. A typical example is that of alpha blocking drug by the name of prazosin. Now, in a trial that was done a few years ago, not a few, let's say a decade or so ago, a very large trial which showed that patients who were on alpha blocker, prazosin, their blood pressure did get lowered, but their mortality was higher. Okay. So whenever we are using a surrogate endpoint, we have to be very clear that it represents the true endpoint. Okay.
Thank you so much, sir. The next question is by Dr. Amita Patial. She wants to know regarding some more information on internal or external validity of clinical trials.
Okay. So, what is the meaning of validity? The word itself means if your trial is valid. You would really want to do a trial or any study only if it was valid. Valid. It has to be valid internally. It has to be valid externally. Now, when we say internally valid, that means our methods, our procedures should be such that they generate information, they generate data, generate results which are true representative or true picture of the truth. Our aim is to achieve the truth. We know that we cannot achieve the total truth, the 100% truth. We try to go, closer and closer to that truth. We achieve to go towards that. But in order to do that, our procedures that we do, like randomization, blinding, the inclusion of subjects as per the inclusion criteria written in the protocol, follow-up of a patient as per, protocol, the measurements, any measurements that we do, they should be done very, very thoroughly. If all of this is done, we say the internal validity of our trial is very high. The external validity is nothing but, as I said earlier, it is generalizability, which means the results of your trial are applicable to other patients or not. For example, in this particular trial, they say white race was most common. So are these results equally good in people who are non-whites? We cannot say that. Okay. Similarly, if the age group includes, say, 25 to 55 years of patients in a study, will you say that these results are applicable to a patient who is 75 years of age? No, we cannot say that. So that's why the importance of inclusion-exclusion criteria, that you keep your exclusion criteria based on what type of external validity you want in your study. If you want high external validity, then you have rather loose inclusion-exclusion criteria where you don't exclude too many patients and try to include as many patients as you want. Now, typically, if you look at, important clinical trials versus the type of patients you will be seeing in your OPD, most of the times, the trial results will not match a typical patient that you see in the OPD. This is because of these inclusion-exclusion criteria. What is the next?
Dr. Nipun Verma wants to ask something. Dr. Nipun, you can kindly unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you, sir, for the lecture. I want to ask you, sir, can we ascertain superiority in the non-inferiority trial?
Okay.
And sometimes Kaplan-Meier may be showing p-value significant, and the two mortality rates may be grossly different. So how do you ascertain that in non-inferiority trial?
No, the second part I did not get.
So sometimes, let's say we have done a trial drug A versus B, and you get a mortality rate of like say 20% and 40% in arms A and B, and p-value is significant on Kaplan-Meier. How does it change your assessment?
Change the?
Let's say the mortality rate in one arm is 20%.
Yes.
Another arm is 40%.
Mm-hmm.
And a priori hypothesis was non-inferiority.
Mm-hmm.
And the p-value is significant on Kaplan-Meier.
P-value is?
Significant.
Okay.
The less than 0.05.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you ascertain superiority in non-inferiority trials? That sometimes I am confused.
Okay. So there is someone also has asked the same question. Kindly elaborate more about non-inferiority trials and margin and confidence interval. So I'll combine these 2 or 3 questions, and you see, a non-inferiority trial shows that your treatment, your new treatment, whatever new drug, let's say it's a new drug, is not inferior to the existing drug that is already there. Okay. Now, to show this, you need to demonstrate that there is, okay, so what you are assuming is that your new drug is going to be more or less equally effective. Okay. So let's say, as Dr. Nipun said, say 20% is the failure rate with the standard of care, and you think that your new drug will also be 20% effective. But if it is not 20% effective and it's slightly less effective, say 18%, failure rate is 18% or 15%. Now, what do I say? My drug is inferior or not? This is the question that we need to answer in a non-inferiority trial. Now, what should be this margin? Shall it be 5 if it is 5% or 10%? What is the difference between the two arms of this margin? Now, how this margin is decided is based on basically a US FDA guidance, but in short, the margin is decided from a superiority trial. Okay, so the same old drug which you have, suppose it had shown superior to placebo in a superiority trial and it was better by 5%. Okay, so that 5% will be taken as the non-inferiority margin. So when you see this difference, so I mean, basically, if you ask me, it's sort of I won't call it a scam, but some amount of dishonesty is there in this non-inferiority trial. I'll explain why. Because what the company think or they want to show is that although their new drug will be inferior to the existing drug, it may be superior in terms of, say, less side effects or ease of administration. Okay, so that there is some other aspect that although the failure rate with with this drug is slightly more, but because of those advantages, it still should be used. Based on this, they seek approval from the regulatory authority. So this margin is absolutely critical, how much margin you keep. In the example that I showed, I'm really, surprised that they choose a margin of 4.2% and they get a result of 4%, which is, quite a strange thing. But nevertheless, so what is this margin of 5%? Now you see, when you have this difference, let's say 20% versus 15%, okay, this is a margin. But this difference of 5% is not what we look at. What we look at is the confidence interval of this difference that you got between the two arms. Okay. So if the difference is 5%, confidence interval is 1% versus 10%. Lower part is not important for our this case in non-inferiority. It's the upper margin, that is 10%. Okay. Now this 10% non-inferiority margin, this margin, this interval should not have been crossed by the, the margin that you kept in the beginning. If you kept a margin of 9% as the difference between the two arms, and the confidence interval, although the actual difference is 4%, which is less than 9%, but the confidence interval is 9.5%, then you cannot claim non-inferiority. If the confidence interval is below that 9%, although your drug is inferior, but the upper limit of confidence interval does not cross, then you say, okay, my drug is non-inferior. Now it's very interesting. If you look at the figures of these, trials, you will see the standard no treatment arm and the non-inferiority arm, which is on one side of this figure, and where it shows that your drug is inferior, actually inferior, because it's not crossing the line of no difference. Okay, if it crosses the line of no difference, it's in, it's not considered to be. I mean, this result is not equivocal. But if it's not there, it's here. That means it is inferior, but because that margin has not been crossed, we call it non-inferior. Now, we wrote a paper on this aspect of trials. We said that if you are having a non-inferiority margin and you say that confidence interval should not cross that margin, let us do the same thing with superiority trials. In non-inferiority trials, you are comparing two active drugs. Both drugs are working, okay? But in superiority, you are saying that one is placebo, which is inactive, and one is active drug. There is no concept of this superiority margin, okay? But we argue that there should be a concept of superiority margin in the same way as there is a concept of non-inferiority margin, that only if the new drug is superior to placebo by a certain margin, only then we should claim superiority. But of course, pharma industry is never going to agree to that, because many of their drugs will be considered non-superior if such a concept of margin is introduced. Now, okay, coming back to the non-inferiority topic. Now, suppose in the trial you find that actually your new drug comes out to be better than the old drug, okay? But you had planned it as a non-inferiority, as Dr. Nipun asked. Now here what you have to do is, you have to again think of this beforehand. You can't do it afterwards. So what you say is that our statistical analysis section will be a two-step procedure, okay? In the first step, we'll test for non-inferiority. If non-inferiority is claimed, that means the result is statistically significant for non-inferiority, we will test for superiority. This two-step procedure is a valid procedure in these cases, and then you can show that, okay, our new drug actually turns out to be superior. Okay, so this is in brief. If there is still anything left, you please ask, and then maybe I'll clarify further.
I think the question asked by Dr. Ishan is answered by Professor Malhotra. The next question is by Dr. Devashish. Will you kindly elaborate the non-inferior margin or confidence interval?
Will you kindly what?
Will you kindly elaborate the non-inferior margin and confidence interval?
Okay, you see, whenever you are using two treatments, there will be two arms in any trial, okay? the failure rate or success rate will not be exactly equal. Okay, even if you use two very similar drugs, let's say you compare enalapril with ramipril, both are ACE inhibitors, both you compare say in hypertension, you will not get exactly similar result, right? Like uh, blood pressure improvement seen in 80% patients with enalapril, you will not see exact 80% with ramipril. It can be 81%, 79%, 85%, 70%, and so there will be some difference. Okay, so whenever there is a difference, when you calculate the difference between the two arms, say 5% difference, you can also calculate from that difference the confidence interval of that difference. Okay, right? So this part is statistics. So you have a difference in the two arms. You calculate the confidence interval of the two arms. Earlier we used to do it manually. Nowadays it's only done by software. So you have calculated that difference. Okay. So this is the first aspect of this question, that understand that there is a difference between two arms and there is a confidence interval of that difference. Now, when we say non-inferiority, we say that our new drug that we are trying to bring will not be inferior to the existing treatment. We are not saying it is going to be superior. We are saying it will not be inferior. Okay. So, but we say it will not be inferior, but there there we claim that okay, it will, but what should be the difference between the two arms for us to say that it is not inferior? You see, if let's say efficacy of one arm is 80%, other arm is 40%, and we say that it is not inferior, it won't look good. Okay, if we say 80% versus 75%, it may be okay. 80% versus 70%, it may be okay. So this so this non-inferiority margin, or D, delta D, this margin is calculated or estimated based on previous studies or based on how much difference was there between placebo and active drug. There are many guidelines on how to calculate this margin, but in any case, this should be a margin which should also be clinically relevant. So as a clinician, as a scientist, as a physician in charge of those patients, you should also be able to, make sure that okay, this type of margin is should be okay. It is not too excessive margin, that you have 80% versus 60%. You publish the data, your trial, and someone says, your margin was so large. How come you are claiming non-inferiority when the margin is so large? So, but the issue here is not of the margin or the difference between the two arms per se, but in the confidence interval of that difference. When you have a say margin of 10, the confidence interval should not cross 10. Now this is the main point that you need to keep in mind. If the confidence interval crosses that margin, then you cannot claim that your drug is not inferior. Okay. So this concept of difference between the two treatment arms, but difference is not important. It's the confidence interval of that difference. The margin that you have kept initially in your sample size calculations as the non-inferiority margin, that difference, that margin should not be crossed by the confidence interval. That's the main thing that you have to learn from this.
The next question is by Dr. Meenakshi. Are the RCTs before publication assessed by some committees or follow specific guidelines? Because some of the RCTs published do not seem to be included all the parameters or as per the guidelines mentioned.
As per the?
As per the guidelines.
You have to just say that again. Okay, I can see the command. I'll just let me read.
Okay.
So that's a very important point. again, today the questions are extremely interesting and very, very good questions, all relevant, highly relevant questions. Now, you see, this in itself is a topic which, you can have a separate lecture only on this topic. It's so interesting. What I don't know, Dr. Meenakshi is it? Dr. Meenakshi is asking is that, you see, you wrote a trial protocol. You said that my primary endpoint will be death, for example, but because there was no difference in death, you simply don't mention it in your publication. There was a difference in, say, length of hospital stay. So you mention only that and you publish your result. Now this used to be a very common occurrence in the past, that companies, pharma companies, even investigators like us would mention something as a, primary endpoint or secondary endpoint. Okay, we would give a list of these endpoints in our trial protocol, but at the time of publication, we would change and we would add some other endpoints which were not originally there, but were added later on because, we did our statistical analysis and they came out to be significant. Now, this is extremely commonly done. I mean, I'm aware of many examples of how common it is done. But to avoid this thing, came up the concept of registry. Was first of all a WHO registry of clinical trials, then US started, even we started in India clinical trial registry. Now the purpose of those registries is that you have to mention your primary endpoint, your trial duration, your follow-up, your treatment, what treatment will you give, how many patients will you enroll. So at least if I want, I see a published paper, I can go back and verify whether, people followed whatever they wrote in that protocol, or they changed something in between. Now, how many people do it, and whether it's commonly done, it's still done, but some improvement is there. But of course, it is simply not possible for anyone to check all the endpoints and, match them with the published literature. For this, we had, in this regard, we had written a paper in our PGI's own journal, in which we had proposed that when we send an article for publication, a clinical trial article for publication, we should include a table of, a separate table for the editor and the peer reviewer, that, okay, these were the proposed endpoints, these were the proposed statistical analysis, and this was the actual that we did, so that you can compare. There is no committee as such who checks it. Ethics committee will check the trial protocol, and there is no other committee. Some institutes have scientific committees also, they will check, but otherwise no one else will check. So it is basically left to the investigators to be honest and report what they thought. If if you want to report something that was not pre-planned, so mention it that this is an analysis which was not pre-planned, which is typically called a post hoc analysis. This is a post hoc analysis, and this should only be used as hypothesis generating kind of thing, and not hypothesis, confirmatory kind of answer. Just before we move to the next, if there is a next question, I would want to return to Dr. Nipun's second part of the question, which was about the hazard ratio. Dr. Nipun, can you say what was that question? About hazard ratio in survival analysis, you had asked. I missed that answer.
The question was asked by Dr. Ishan Sharma. He wants to ask can you kindly explain elaborate little on hazard ratio?
Okay. So you see, in the type of data that we have in this trial, because patients are being followed up, some events will occur in between. Some patients will continue without any event. Some patients will drop out. Some patients, for some patients, there will be follow-up data for 5 years available. For patients who were enrolled later on, there are data of only of 1 year available, and the study gets stopped. Now, this type of data is typically called censored data. This is censoring. Now, our typical tests for calculation of say relative risk are not too good in such type of data, although we often use them. So in this type of data, better is to use what is called a survival analysis, and Kaplan-Meier is a survival analysis. Now, as you can see here, the data is not only in terms of number of people dying or some event occurring, but it's the rate of that event over time. It's a rate. So there is a rate of a certain event in treatment arm in one arm, rate of an event in the other arm. If you divide these two rates, you get what is called the hazard ratio. So basically, quite similar to relative risk. The only difference is that it's not a one-time thing, it's a rate over time. That's all. And you can, from that, the interpretation is the same. If the hazard rate ratio is 2, that means the likelihood of the rate of an event is 2 times in one arm versus the other. Absolutely same interpretation. But the only thing is that it's a rate of event over time. That's all.
Meanwhile, we are taking 1 or 2 last questions. Participants are kindly requested to fill the attendance form and feedback form. The link is there in your chat box. I would like to request Dr. Amita Patial, because the question she has mentioned that can you please repeat about the null hypothesis with respect to non-inferiority trials. I think Professor Samir has already discussed about it in one more question. If you have further queries, you can kindly unmute yourself and ask your questions directly to sir.
Yes, of course.
No, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Amita. Thank you, sir, for such an excellent talk. Any questions from the audience?
Okay, then. Thank you very much. Thanks, Nipun, for joining.
Thank you so much, sir, for a wonderful session.